Welcome, everyone, to a new episode on our Rare and Real interview series. Today, we're joined by Ella Balasa, an extremely brilliant young healthcare educator and scientific communicator who's also living with a rare respiratory disease in cystic fibrosis. We're going to hear much from Ella about her story today. Ella, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Nate, for having me. I appreciate it.
Um, so, if for our audience, you were diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at 18 months of age, just a year and a half old, and you've been battling this disease your whole life. Can you share a little bit about, your journey, the early diagnosis, and sort of the hospitalizations and frequent infections that you encountered along your life?
Absolutely. Well, when I was born, my parents had no idea what cystic fibrosis was, and um, in my early infant days, I was diagnosed with like failure to thrive. I was very underweight. Couldn't, yeah, really get any nutrition, and I was always sick, respiratory illnesses. The pediatricians thought I just had really bad allergies. But then I developed pneumonia when I was 18 months old. And that's when my mom was always taking me to the doctor, always trying to make sure I wasn't catching a cold, even though I was always had respiratory symptoms. And so when I got pneumonia, that's when the doctors thought that there was probably something more going on. And that's when they tested me for cystic fibrosis. And again, my parents had no idea what the condition was. And so it was a really, a learning curve for them, obviously a really shift in reality and, having to take care of a really sick child. And I spent, growing up, I tried to live as normal of a childhood as possible, going to school and, partaking in sports and activities with my peers. But I was also hospitalized a lot. Depending on the year, some years I would be in the hospital for getting intravenous antibiotics to treat the lung infections that are caused by cystic fibrosis. I would be, in the hospital 2, 3, 4 times a year, on for probably 2 to 3 weeks each duration to get these courses of antibiotics to treat these infections that were preventing me for really reducing the function of my lungs and my quality of life. And, some years I did better, but obviously cystic fibrosis being a progressive condition, as the cycle of infection in the lungs and inflammation from the body trying to fight these infections, it really causes that decline in scar tissue in the lungs. And so over time, it's really impeded me and really limited my physical abilities. And these infections are become harder and harder to treat with effective antibiotics because of the colonization of these infections for very long term in the body and the lungs. So it's certainly a life changing condition and life limiting.
Gotcha.
But nonetheless, I've tried to do as much as I can despite it.
Gotcha. So specifically on antibiotic resistant infections, and you actually are a microbiologist sort of background. You have a biology background, and you studied that through school. And so, if you could take a minute for our audience and describe the phenomenon of antibiotic resistance and why that's such a problem for patients with CF.
Right. So as I described, having to use these antibiotics chronically to treat infections, as these are chronic infections that do not go away in CF. And so even when you use a course of antibiotics to treat an infection and subdue, beat back the level of infection in the lungs, there is still that underlying level of bacteria. And so as time goes on, when these bacteria kind of build up their strength again against in the lungs, then they require more antibiotics to treat them again. And so this long-term use of the same few antibiotics that we have available to us today then leads to antibiotic resistance. So that is where these bacteria can fend off the antibiotics that are trying to kill them, because they develop these resistance mechanisms. And so, as I said, like, I have had periods of time, and I'll talk more in a little bit about the moment in which really I experienced a pan-resistant infection, meaning like I was using the strongest antibiotics that we have available to us, but they weren't working to treat my infection. And that's ultimately what happens with antibiotic resistance, is that the bacteria become resistant to all types of antibiotics to treat them.
Right. So it's very frustrating for a patient to experience, and families to experience, the journey where there aren't medicines to treat an infection. And this is not just a problem in CF. This is not just a problem in lung disease. This is a major global public health issue, drug resistant bacteria. Sort of, some people call it the silent epidemic. And you were even on a panel recently at the Bio International convention talking about this. Is there anything you would like to share from our audience based on the industry's perspective on antimicrobial resistance?
Yeah, I mean, as you just described, antibiotic resistance is a growing pandemic in its own form, and we don't have effective treatments, because traditional antibiotics are less and less effective. And so I have become a really strong voice and advocate for the development of novel therapeutics against infections other than traditional antibiotics. And with, bringing my voice to these conversations, as you described, I've been in a part of a couple of documentaries, one of them being called The Silent Pandemic, sharing my own journey battling these resistant infections. And I'm also part of the World Health Organization's AMR task force of survivors, where it's a global group of patient advocates that are engaging with stakeholders to bring awareness to and humanize the problem of antibiotic resistance, and trying to get more funding from an investment standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, from government policies to try
Yeah,
to
it's desperately needed.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Um,
so go ahead.
so I do want to get into that issue a little bit deeper, but just kind of bring it back to cystic fibrosis and your story. You're relatively stable now, and you've been eligible for modulators like Trikafta. And we've talked earlier on this Rare and Review interview series with people who weren't so fortunate to have a modulator based on their underlying genetic makeup, and not wanting to be left behind in the 10% of the CF population that's in this extremely rare mutation group. But you, however, sort of were one of the lucky ones. Can you talk about your experience, and then how modulators have really changed your life?
Yes, I'm very fortunate to have had access to Trikafta modulator therapies when I did. So to share a bit about that journey and story where I was describing before, in 2019, I was facing a very severe lung infection that was not responding to any antibiotics at all. And
And
I was
what
on
was the pathogen specifically?
Pseudomonas. So I was battling
Pseudomonas.
a Pseudomonas infection, and which is the bacteria that I've been colonized with in my lungs ever since I was very young. And I was on colistin intravenously, a number of other antibiotics as well, intravenously and inhaled. And I had 18% lung function. I was on
Wow.
oxygen 24/7. I could barely breathe to walk in my house. I was winded. I was short of breath. So really, my lungs were barely functioning, you could say. You don't really, looking back, I realize how ill I was, but in the moment, it's you don't even grasp it, and it's really,
Can't imagine.
it is very serendipitous the way that this all happened. But I, as I said, I was battling this really difficult infection, and I just happened to find out about phage therapy, which it's the use of, it's a novel type of pathway to treat infections, and it's using a very specialized virus to attack a bacterial host. So it doesn't, it's not like a virus that attacks our bodies and our immune systems, but it just attacks a bacteria. And so this was used through expanded access. So this is through what's called an emergency IND, that researchers at Yale University were able to treat me with this phage therapy. And it helped to treat that very acute infection that I was facing at the time. But my lungs, so it treated that infection, and I was able to stabilize after that point to some degree. But I was still my lungs were still very damaged and deteriorated, and I was referred to get a transplant in the subsequent months. And then later that summer, and this was a couple of months after trying phage therapy, after being put on into the lung transplant program. And that's when Trikafta was approved. And I felt stable enough at that point where I was like, okay, let me hold out. Let me not get listed for transplant to see if I can try Trikafta. And it has helped. It has allowed me to remain stable. Although with very low lung function, I currently have about 27% lung function, and I still use oxygen, and I still deal with infections, quite regularly, but it's provided a little bit more stability for my life. And I'm very grateful.
That's amazing. It's an amazing story. You'd never know by looking at you directly that your lung function is sub 30%. I appreciate you being here and contributing your story to the community. How specifically has your life changed now? Like, how many exacerbations do you have on a routine basis? How often have you needed to go to the hospital since that amazing phage therapy 5, 6 years ago?
So, fortunately, since that year, 2019, of phage therapy, and of starting Trikafta later that year, prior to that, I was using intravenous antibiotics every 3 months or so. And now, since that time, since Trikafta and since phage, I've only had to use intravenous antibiotics one time in the last 5 years. And though I still do struggle with uh, persistent infections, I still have to use oral and inhaled antibiotics intermittently. There is just the way that it's improved my quality of life is that I just have less of the mucus and bacterial burden in my lungs, and it doesn't build up as quickly and as significantly. And so I'm able to go, in my day-to-day life, I'm able to go a little bit longer time in between having to do breathing treatments to clear the mucus from my airways. Really, the significant change is not needing to be relied on getting IV in my arm for 3 weeks at a time. And, I'm able to travel and live independently and take care of myself and, live the life that I've always wanted to. And it's been truly amazing.
Well, it's an amazing medical journey. Kudos to everybody at Yale University that contributed to the phage therapy. Kudos to the companies that contributed to modulator development in the therapeutic space. It's a real testament to how it's going to take multiple therapies, not just one single drug, to address chronic respiratory diseases and specifically rare diseases. And that's what we're trying to do at Vast Therapeutics. We're trying to develop a therapy, Ella, as you are aware, that combats Pseudomonas first and foremost and attacks drug resistant bacteria for which we have no available treatment. So, for patients like you, who have been battling Pseudomonas their whole life, we would hope to intervene much earlier, get rid of that organism, eradicate it completely, and also then correct your disease along the way through the use of nitric oxide. So, that's our mission at VAST. And you talked about expanded access. There's new legislation that has been passed that creates a little bit easier access for patients. Instead of going through an experimental IND, they can utilize the product under right to try, the legislation that enables you and your physician to decide to use the product once we've completed phase 1 trials. And we do have some exciting news that VAST is looking to complete those studies later this calendar year. So by early 2026, for patients who are suffering from a life-threatening infection and have no other alternatives, or are pan resistant, as she mentioned, to every other drug, there will be sort of an emergency option available for you long before this gets approved in the clinic. So your story is a great example of how innovation, like the things VAST is trying to bring to market as well, can help patients in 26 and beyond. Um, so that's about all the time we have for part 1 of our interview today. We're going to be back with Ella to listen to part 2 and her patient advocacy journey and how she's turned her lifelong battle with CF into sort of a career and award-winning patient advocacy speaker on a number of different panels throughout the industry. Ella, we really appreciate your time today, and we hope that her story inspires other patients to look for experimental medicines and be a part of clinical trials if they're available, because the role of the patient is absolutely critical as we develop new drugs. We can't do it without the patients. And so, Ella, we appreciate your time. If you're not already following us on Vast Therapeutics at YouTube, you can see part 1 and part 2 of this entire interview on our YouTube page. We appreciate the time that you've invested this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.